Welcome back to another episode of I Wish They Knew, a show where we share big ideas that deserve more attention in about the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. I'm Joe Hirsch. Today's wish comes from Lieutenant Colonel Scott Mann. Scott is a retired Green Beret who served in Army and Special Operations around the world for more than 20 years. Today, he's the CEO of Rooftop Leadership and is the founder of the Hero's Journey, which is committed to helping veterans tell their stories in transition. It's a great cause and it's great work. Scott's appeared on Fox News and CNN and other major outlets and is the best-selling author of Nobody is Coming to Save You. Scott, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So what do you wish more people knew?
I wish more people knew how to make better human connections in times of low trust.
So you served in a lot of those environments all around the world as a member of Green Berets. Correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't Green Berets different than other elite units in the Army like the SEALs or Delta Forces? What sets them apart?
Yeah, they are. I mean, make no mistake, all of the special operators in the Special Ops Command inventory are highly unique, highly specialized, and all great at what they do. They each have a different charter. But most of them have a charter that is focused on surgical targeting, of taking a target down very quickly and then coming off the target very quickly, and usually doing that mission unilaterally with no one else. But Green Berets are quite different in the sense that we specialize in unconventional warfare, or working by, with, and through indigenous people to help them stand up on their own from the inside out, from the community level. I tell people that a Green Beret is kind of a combination of John Wick, Lawrence of Arabia, and the Verizon guy. Or the Sprint guy, or whatever it is. In other words, they're relationship-based connectors who just happen to be lethal, but only when it's necessary.
Yeah. So it's really about relationships first, right?
It really is. And I think that it's at the core of every mission that Green Berets do. They're very capable of direct action and surgical strike, but for them, typically, that's going to be the last resort.
So give us an example of how you build trust in those kinds of environments, because I can't imagine sitting across the table from someone whose life experience, whose lived experience is so different than yours. How do you do that in some of these remote and war-torn villages all over the world?
I think it starts with a mindset shift where, in the world that we live in today, and this is what I talk about a lot in Nobody's Coming to Save You, we're so casual about our relationships. Our social capital, our tangible and intangible linkages with other humans is completely transactional. And it's really to the depth that we need to just get a transaction done. In most cases, that's been my experience. Whereas in special forces, when you go into a trust depleted area, by design, it is a rough place that needs to be stabilized from the inside out. So whether you live or die, whether your mission succeeds or fails, is how you connect to the party sitting across from you. And that might be an elder tickling the trigger of his AK-47, deciding whether or not to dispatch you. So you have to connect as if your life depends on it. And when that is your driving factor, then the relationship itself takes on a whole different flair. How you approach with your intention takes on a whole different meaning, and it just changes the whole dynamic. And I think that's the first thing, is the mindset of not connecting casually, but rather like your life depends on it.
So with intentionality and with the same level of high stakes as the environment calls for.
Yeah, but if you think about it too, Joe, I mean, we're social creatures. We don't have fur, fangs, or claws. We sit on top of the food chain because for thousands and thousands of years, we have connected like our life depends on it. We build better teams, better groups than any other mammal because we have to. Our lives do depend on it. Our livelihoods depend on it, no matter how modern we think we are. At the end of the day, every crisis, every pandemic, every train wreck, every natural disaster is solved or not solved by the depth of human relations in that arena, and that's our reality, and it's not going to change in our life.
So give me an example of how some of that would play out, across continents in a more contained environment, say a typical workplace. What does that look like?
Well, so like if you say that the connect as your life depends on it, then what it requires, and remember, you're going into a churn of disconnection and division and distrust that's been pre-existing for years. So if you take that connect as if your life depends on it mindset, one of the first things that I talk about is you've got to meet people where they are, not where you want them to be, right? You've got to recognize that the first order of business is that the relationship itself is the asset. And so, obtaining a relationship with a prominent elder or an influencer in a community, you can't just walk in with your hand outstretched and say, "Hi, I'm from the government. How you like me so far?" You have to build a level of initial rapport where you bring the emotional temperature down, where the other party doesn't see you as a threat, where they feel somewhat psychologically safe. Initial rapport, where you just make a human connection first. And that usually involves meeting people where they are, not where you want them to be. So, can you be interested, not interesting? Can you be focused on the other party and the pictures in their head with such a level of intensity that you can actually see the pain and goals and cite it back to them to where they say, as Chris Voss does, that's right. So really being intentional about the pictures in the head of the other party and insistent that you're not going to move forward on any agenda, any outcomes until you are absolutely crystal clear on their pain and their goals, the pictures in their heads. Meet them where they are, not where you want them to be. And that is where you move forward. That's actually where human connection is established.
So what I'm hearing you say, it sounds a lot like empathy building, and that practice of building empathy, it's hard to really break through and understand not only what the person needs or feels, but to know who that person is. How did you do that with people whose lives were so completely different than your own?
And I don't disagree with the empathy, or as Chris Voss says, tactical empathy. I don't disagree with vulnerability. Where I kind of have a challenge with that, though, is I feel like it's you're trying to feel something or demonstrate something in the moment that could be contrived unless you're really careful about what you're doing. What I've found that works much better and answers your question, I think, is, again, the relationship is the asset. I want to develop a relationship with this individual, and I'm willing to do whatever I need to do to give myself a chance to do that. And it starts with me meeting them where they are, not where I want them to be. So I want to be relatable. That's the first thing I want to do. If I want to set an intention walking into that room before I walk in, is I want to be relatable to this person's pain. That's it. I mean, if I can go to the first meeting and I feel and I sense and I understand what their pain is, then vulnerability, empathy, all of those things will manifest themselves and come alongside me in an emotional way that's appropriate versus saying, I need to be empathetic, right? I want to be relatable. I want to be able to relate to the pictures in this person's head. I want to be able to be relatable to their pain. I want to feel what their pain is. I want to sense what their pain is. I want to have a sense of it. And vice versa. I want them to at some point have a sense of mine. But in the beginning, it's just about being relatable. You can even ask yourself, does this person see me as relatable right now? And if not, making the adjustments so that I am purely relatable to that person. And I think that's a much more achievable end game in an ambiguous situation cross-culturally or in a low-trust environment.
What if you can't see the pictures in the head of the other person?
Yeah.
You're unable to put that all together. How do you develop that positioning to help you relate to that person and to become relatable to them?
Right. So that's a great question. And a lot of times you won't be able to in the beginning, especially if trust is low or the emotions are high or you're operating in an area that's very different than yours. But a lot of times we are running in this transactional world, Joe, to such a degree that we don't take the time to even try to see the pictures in their head before I walk in the room. In this day and age with social media and these dopamine dispensers that we carry around, if I walk into a room of a high stakes engagement and I say, "So, where are you from?" I have not done my homework at all. There's been no pre-work to connect with this person at all. And so a lot of times you can see the pictures in their head just by good old-fashioned due diligence, looking at goals and pain of just researching that person, talking to third parties who know them, really trying to see the pictures in their head about what they value and what their pain is before I walk in. That's number one. Number two is I want to make a human connection first. I want to just connect, and I want to get that palpable sense that we're connected as individuals. It might be eye contact, it might be a handshake, it might be asking about their kids, but you can feel it when you have a human connection with someone. There's a subterranean feeling that we get. Then, if I can't see the pictures in their head, I want to keep asking thoughtful, open-ended questions that start with what and how, that allow me to get a sense of their goal, what they value and what their pain is, what they value and what their goals are. over and over again. And it might be 5, 6 questions that I have to ask before I get there, or 10. And I can even be explicit and say, look, it's really important for me to understand what you value here. And I don't want to move forward until we do. Is that okay with you? And can I ask some more questions about that? And typically most people are fine to do that. One other reason I think that's so important, Joe, is typically what I've found is that approach of questionology that Warren Berger calls it, or what Chris Voss says, calibrated questions. That's typically when you get the other party ready to listen to what you have to say. When your questions are so focused on their goals and their pain, and you finally articulate it back to them as clearly having a sense of it, and they say something like, that's right, that is when the other party is typically ready to listen to what you have to say. And that's decisive.
I can see how this would be very effective at the outset when you're trying to establish rapport and relatability with the other party, be that with an elder of the Taliban or a junior report in your office. But what about when the relationship has already set in? You've known the person for a little while, and now something has happened that's caused trust to diminish. How do you go about that at this point? It would seem like asking these kinds of questions might feel contrived to the other person.
I'm not so sure. I think honestly, what I worry about today, and I see a lot of business leaders doing it, I see a lot of parents doing it with their kids, a lot of spouses doing it with their spouse or significant other, is we don't value the relationship. We become casual. And so we don't ask about pain and goals anymore. Right. We just take for granted that, this is all good and let's just get to the agenda. Let's just get to the thing. Your kid comes home from school. Hey, Dad, hey, hold on, son. I'm on a call. Just hold on a second. Rather than asking open-ended questions about their day, what their goals were, who ticked you off today, who made you angry. Like, teenagers won't respond to how your day was or what you learned, but they will respond to who ticked them off, and they'll talk about that nonstop. It opens them up, meet them where they are. And then you can start to have a conversation. But I do believe the care and feeding of relationships has suffered greatly in this transactional world, to such a degree that I think ultimately it does come off the rails. And then you have to go into restorative mode, which is what you're talking about. I think that we can establish rapport with the people we love the most every day, and we should. We should never take for granted that a pre-existing relationship is just in autopilot. I think it's a work in progress every day to cultivate that with fresh rapport every time I see them. Now, it's hard, but I think if we can learn to do that with the people we love the most, we'll be even better in life and business. And it's a great place to practice.
Yeah, it's absolutely right that unless you take care of the things that matter, they don't take care of themselves.
They don't, especially in this time of churn. Because, you and I have talked about this a little bit off camera, but, I believe that even the reason that I wrote my book now that's out, Nobody's Coming to Save You, is because the churn that was once reserved for these low trust, high risk, violent places where I worked as a Green Beret, I believe it's made its way here. I believe we are dealing with a version of churn in our own country now that's unprecedented and novel. And so a lot of the things that we've even talked about in the questions that you've asked about sitting across from somebody perceived very different as you are just as relevant here at home as they are in those places of churn where I worked as a Green Beret.
Tell me a little bit more about some of the work you're doing to support the vets who are transitioning into civilian life. You talk about this generosity of scars.
Yeah.
Tell us more about that.
Well, my transition was really rough when I came out in 2013 after a couple of decades, and I found myself as if I had changed planets, honestly. I came home to a country I didn't recognize anymore. And I think Sebastian Junger summed it up well in his book, Tribe, when he said most combat veterans are willing to die for their country. They just don't know how to live for it. And it's hard to know how to live for a country that's tearing itself apart along every imaginable line, from race to religion, and as we're seeing now in the election, to politics. And that really set me into a spiral. I started asking myself, my God, what was the point? All those friends lost and wounded and time away from my family so we could just tear each other apart here at home and demonstrate the same type of shadow tribalism I saw in these places, and it set me into this place where a lot of my mental health stuff, PTS, survivor's guilt, moral injury that I had pushed down just came screaming in. It was ultimately storytelling, a mentor who helped me with storytelling as a modality to heal myself and make sense of a lot of the stuff. And it did. It turns out that storytelling is an ancient approach to very modern problems, and making sense of combat's one of them. And as I started to do that, I realized that I could take the struggles, Joe, the scars, as I call them, internal scars, to include even my own suicidal ideations. And I could repurpose those through narrative in the service of others. I could talk openly my challenge with mental health. I could talk about the loss of friends in combat. I could talk about my own imposter syndrome in front of a bunch of commercial bankers. And it turns out that with storytelling, we listen to stories autobiographically, and we locate ourselves in the narrative of the other person, and we process our own lived experience in the safety of their struggle, in the safety of their story. And we start to make sense of our own lived experience, which creates reciprocity, which creates shared perspective. It is a trust accelerant, this generosity of scars. And in this time that we live in today, where struggle's been diluted out of everything we do, I think it's probably the most effective thing that leaders can do, is to be generous with their scars when they're leading people.
The book is Nobody is Coming to Save You, and the author is Scott Mann. Scott, thanks for your service and for sharing your wish with us today.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate the platform and what you do for the country.